everyone. This is the Portal Fantasy panel. Megan, I believe she said it's going to be at least somewhat interactive. So yeah, I guess take it away. You got the floor now.
So this is going to be a talk about Portal Fantasy, and it's the talk that I give when people ask me to do a workshop, because I still don't know how to do a workshop. I'm not really able to give good writing advice on the fly. I have no idea how I write, so I don't really have any good ways to tell other people how I write. So mostly what I'm going to do is talk like a big nerd, or actually more like a big dork, about something that I really like, and that affects how I write. And maybe it will be useful to you. The idea is that that this will be at least slightly interactive. So I'm hoping that people will be willing to start putting up things in the chat box for everyone here in our little square to read. And I'm thinking that maybe towards the end, I'm going to talk a little while, and then there'll be like a question and answer session maybe at the end, and you can put questions into the chat box. And if I don't see them, maybe somebody else will highlight them. And the other thing is, and I'm not entirely sure how to do this, I was thinking that those people who might be interested in talking a little bit about their project as or a thought experiment at the end of my talk might be willing to address the group. And I think that we can do that by having you raise your hand, and then we'll call on you, and then you can turn your mic and camera on. We'll see if that works. So to get started, and fair warning, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and this is what we're going to be talking about. So just to recap for the people who are coming in, I'm doing a talk about Portal Fantasy, mostly because, as you can see, I don't know how to do a workshop. The idea here is that I'm going to talk a little bit about a book I love, Farah Mendlesohn. So I'd be grateful if those of you who have actually heard of Farah Mendlesohn would put up a thumbs up sign, and then somebody can tell me whether there are any thumbs up signs, because now that I'm screen sharing, I of course can't see Gather. So has anybody ever heard of Farah Mendlesohn?
Got one person in the chat.
There's a couple.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Excellent. So one of the reasons maybe the rest of you have not heard of her is that she's an academic. She taught for many years, I think, at the University of Reading. And this book, Rhetorics of Fantasy, is it's an academic book. And that can be sort of intimidating, but not all academic books are extremely dry and difficult to read. Some of them are really approachable and really very interesting. And for those of you who are interested in writing, I really recommend that you get this one out of the library and at least take a look at it. I also, for myself, found it immensely helpful as a reader, because she gives me language for some things that I didn't really have the vocabulary for. And I'm more able now to be able to say what book I like, and to say when I go in to talk to a librarian that, you know, what I'd really like to read is an immersion, or I'm not that keen on Portal, or I like a subversion of a Portal. And, you know, this is just part of what we have seen since the introduction of the internet, and the fact that we can find people talking about things that we love and find words to describe it, like the introduction of the word trope into daily communication, and how you can say, oh, I like friends to lovers. That sort of language just wasn't available 20 years ago, or at least not in my world. And I love being able to better categorize the things that I like and the things that I don't like. And Rhetorics of Fantasy really helped me do that. So what Mendlesohn argues is that there are 4 categories of fantasy, as defined by the way fantasy enters the world. So those 4 categories start with portal. And I think everybody pretty much knows what a portal fantasy looks like. There's some sort of magical doorway, and you go through the doorway into a fantastic world. And at the end of the story, generally, you come back out of the fantastic world to the ordinary world. Immersion, I think, is also pretty obvious. One of the biggest, most famous ones, of course, is The Fellowship of the Ring. And that's where you have a story where you, as the reader, are dropped right into a world without a whole lot of explanations of that world. In fact, the explanations have to be very carefully snuck into the text so that there's not big, boring info dumps. The third kind is also pretty straightforward. That's the intrusion story. And, you know, it's pretty much what it says on the label. Some magical thing penetrates your ordinary world, and you have to deal with this terrifying or a magical or wonderful intrusion. And then when that magical intrusion has somehow been dealt with, it goes away again and you return to a pretty much normal world. And I don't know if other people know this one. What you're looking at are mostly pictures of whatever books I happen to have on the shelf when I was setting up this talk. But Zilpha Keatley Snyder's Black and Blue Magic was one of my big favorites as a kid. And in it, the main character gets a chance to make a wish. He wishes for wings. He spends the entire book flying around. There are some complications, obviously. And by the end of the book, he has used up all of the magic potion that allows him to fly. And he returns, in a sense, to a very normal, everyday world. The magical intrusion is gone. The last one is the one that can be the most difficult to really explain. And I think the best way to explain it is with an example, which I hope you all know because Joan Aiken's brilliant. Armitage Fly Away Home is a book in which things like leprechauns and unicorns and magical spells and witches next door and that sort of thing not only exist in this world, but are perfectly ordinary. And that's what makes it different from an intrusion story. This isn't, wow, I can't believe they're really vampires, to, oh, no, they're vampires. Everybody knows they're vampires. And yet, the world that it's set in is in every other way exactly like our world. And so, well, actually, before I get to that, and so what I wanted to do, and I'm hoping that this will work, is go through some examples of books and have you in the chat say what kind of book you think it is. And obviously, as I said, I can't see you responding in the chat at the same time as I'm sharing my screen. So I'm going to rely again on my moderator people to shout whatever it is they're reading when they're reading it. Is that okay?
Yeah, I can do that.
Awesome. So The Black Cauldron. What kind of book? Portal, immersion, intrusion, liminal?
Immersion, 3 immersions, 4th.
Okay. I think we're pretty clear on immersion. All right. Wizard of Oz.
Got a bunch of portals.
Okay, right.
Like a lot of portals. Wow.
Yeah, that's like one of the big famous portal stories, right up there with the Narnia. Go through the magic cabinet. You have Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, and you know she always comes back to the normal world at the end. Now, Tuesdays at the Castle, by one of our guests of honor, is set in a world with a castle that is magic. And when it gets bored, usually on Tuesdays, when there are long, boring meetings going on in the throne room, the castle amuses itself by adding extra rooms.
We've got an immersion. Immersion with a question mark. Got a liminal, a couple liminals.
Okay, so the thing about the liminal is that liminal is usually our world. And this is a fantasy world with made-up countries and a made-up history. So I would lean more towards immersion than liminal. Aragon?
Bunch of immersions for Aragon. We do also have a question. Does liminal mean it has to be modern, or can it be historical?
It can be modern, it can be historical. In fact, we'll talk a little bit more of that when we get down a little further in. Or actually, I'm not sure I duplicated that slide. So if I forget, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Fellowship of the Ring. But Aragon is a pretty straightforward immersion story. This slightly tatty book is not actually a book. It's a set of recordings. This, folks, is an early audio book from my childhood. And I used to listen to these records for hours.
Portal scroll by like 10 times in one.
Right. I'm assuming everybody recognizes this one, much like they do The Wizard of Oz, as a really taproot Portal story. I'm thinking people probably know this story.
Bunch of liminals.
Now, it might be a liminal story, but
one intrusion.
I would say intrusion, because in this world, Winnie understands magic and believes in the magic, and the Tuck family understand that there is this magic spring of immortality. But it would be a surprise to the people in the rest of the world of this story that such a thing exists. And so I would say that it's more of an intrusion story. And I think, if I'm remembering Tuck Everlasting correctly, by the end of the story, the option for the immortality spring has gone away in one way or another. And you've returned to a pretty normal world in which there is no magical intrusion. So Tuck Everlasting, I think, would be an intrusion story. And A Wizard of Earthsea?
Got a couple immersions. Immersion with the heart.
Do people know this one? This is T. Kingfisher, otherwise known as Ursula Vernon. And I like all of Ursula's work is just wonderful. I'd have a hard time picking which one I think is the best, but I have a special fondness for this one because in 2016, right after the election, she was loading one chapter a week of this book onto the internet for people to read. And she loaded, 3 extra chapters the day after the election. And I really needed a break from the real world. And all of these years later, I'm still deeply grateful for that break from the real world. And it's the story of a girl whose name is Summer. And she has an opportunity to travel to the world of Orcus, which she, of course, takes because she's not stupid. And that makes this a pretty straightforward Portal story. And I hope that's what other people are typing.
We got a couple portals. Some people saying it's sort of intrusion as well.
Well, it is true that as Summer is hanging out in her backyard, a giant house on rooster feet walks by through the backyard. And in that sense, yes, you might call it an intrusion story because the magic did come to her first. The Cuckoo Tree, also by the author of Armitage, Armitage, Fly Away Home, it is here mostly as a demonstration that just because you write one Portal story doesn't mean that all of your work is going to be Portal stories. And there are a couple authors, particularly Joan Aiken and Diana Wynne Jones, who, they're all over the field. They write in every single mode of these 4 options that that Farah Mendlesohn is laying out. So yeah, The Cuckoo Tree is an immersion story. I hope you all have read it. If you haven't, I really highly recommend it. And let's see. Not Your Sidekick by C.D. Lee. Now, if you're familiar at all with her just from her conversations as guest of honor, you know that what she's writing about is somebody who doesn't want to be a sidekick in a world filled with superheroes. And there's been some sort of solar flare and inciting incident, and suddenly superhero powers started to show up in the population. And that makes this story...
Seeing a bunch of liminals, one or two mentions of immersion or intrusion.
I'm going to go with an immersion. But again, the line between a liminal and an immersion story, when you're looking at a world that's a lot like our world, is difficult to make really clear cut. And Mendlesohn talks about what she calls fuzzy sets. And she talks about what the purpose of the categories are. And it's not so much to start nerd wars, like where you argue about exactly which category a book fits into, the way you argue about, what are the 10 best rock albums of all time. This is supposed to be an aid for looking at a story and understanding it better. Or it's an aid for me as a reader to have a vocabulary for what kind of a story I'm looking for, so that when I walk into a library and I tell a librarian that I need a new book to read, I can tell her what kind of book I'm looking for. Maybe I'm in the mood for an immersion. Maybe I'm in the mood for something else. This one, another personal favorite, like Joan Aiken, Diana Wynne Jones is all over the map. She's written, I think, every single kind of story.
Seeing a bunch of immersions for this one.
Now, it is an immersion story, I think. But the reason that I put it in here, and the reason one of the reasons I really like it, is that it's an immersion story with a portal. And if you changed not so much the viewpoint of main characters, but like the viewpoint of the narrator, the third person omniscient narrator of this story, introduces the main character, Sophie, and explains the world in which she lives in as a sort of fantasy world where there are a lot of fairy tale elements that are true. And most especially if there are ever 3 children in the family, the first 2 are going to fail and the third one is going to be a raging success, because that's just how things are in this fantasy world. But as the story progresses and you meet the wizard Howl, there is this fabulous moment where a door that we all know is a magical door, and we all know opens to admit you to different places in the fabulous fantasy world. You can teleport to the coast, you can teleport to the capital city by passing through this doorway. At one point in the story, the setting on the door is changed, and the magic teleporting door carries you to Wales. And you realize that this entire time you have been inside a fantasy world with a portal connection to our own world. So there is a portal in this story. And if you're looking at the wizard Howl, it's a portal story for him. But for the reader and for the main character, Sophie, it's an immersion story, which just, I think, goes to show that Diana knew exactly what she was doing and was deliberately playing with some of the sort of stylistic elements of a portal story. What does a portal story look like for all the people in the fantasy world? It looks like Howl's Moving Castle. And here's Harry Potter, because nobody can talk about anything without at least mentioning Harry Potter. What do you guys think this is?
Seeing a mix of everything except intrusion. Oh, no, there we got our first intrusion.
Okay, so intrusion. You have that totally normal world of the Dursleys, and magic stuff shows up, right? And that might make this an intrusion story. On the other hand, you have this wizarding world in which everybody knows that there are wizards and non-wizarding people, and there are dragons and ogres and trolls and unicorns and things like that, which might make this an immersion story. But it's also a portal story, because a portal doesn't necessarily have to be a magic cabinet. A portal can also be you are living in a perfectly ordinary world that's ordinary to you anyway, and you go on a quest and you go to some place that's completely unfamiliar, that's fantastic, that needs to have somebody explain carefully what's going on for you and for the reader to understand what's happening. So Harry comes from a perfectly ordinary world, and in every book he goes to the world of wizards, and in every book he has to come back. Now, it is true he does this by way initially of a magic brick wall that he walks through in the train station and gets on a magic train. And you could say that that's the portal, but there are all sorts of ways that he gets to that magical world by car or whatever. And he always comes back at the end to an extremely normal existence, at least until you get to the end of the series. And so what you have, I think, in Harry Potter is, depending on how you want to look at it, an intrusion story, a portal story, a liminal story, and an immersion story. And why I put the book here is to emphasize the fact that if you want to talk about portal stories, then you talk about what makes this a portal story. But if you don't want to talk about portal stories, you want to talk about immersion stories, you can still talk about this book and talk about it in terms of an immersion story. So what Mendlesohn is trying to give you is really a set of tools for talking about stories. And she's pointing out that when you have certain kinds of stories, they come with certain kinds of sort of stylistic requirements. And the last one I want to ask you about before I go on with that is, so you want to be a wizard. What kind of a story is it?
Seeing a mix of intrusion and liminal. Yeah, just those two, but a fairly even split.
Okay.
A few portals as well.
Well, there is a portal. Like Howl's Moving Castle, you see Diane using elements of different stories. And so you have a little bit of intrusion with a book that just shows up on the shelf. But usually with an intrusion story, what you see is an end at the end of the book of the fantastic magical element. So if the main characters return to a perfectly ordinary existence, then that's more of an intrusion story. But I think it's a little bit more of an immersion story, because there is a group of people, much like in Harry Potter, that know all about magic. And once you see the main characters connecting with those people, then they are moving through a world where magic is real. And that hovers, I think, between liminal and immersion. And again, you can talk about the liminality, if that's what's interesting to you. And you can look at Diane's book and you can see how she gave the story a sort of feeling of magic as a secret possibility known to only some people, and how she also gave it the magic is such a mundane thing that you can find it in the phone book, essentially. And if you are interested in doing one thing or the other, when you look at So You Want to Be a Wizard, you can watch how somebody who's really skillful has done it before. Oh, and I forgot this one, Special Case. I don't know if people are as familiar with this one, but it's one of my big favorites. So I stuck it in here because you should always stick your favorites in if you have an excuse. Elizabeth Wein wrote The Winter Prince, which was a retelling of the King Arthur story. This is a sequel. And what you have is not fantasy in the sense of the fantastic and magic. This is one of those fantasies that is a fantasy by way of being set in a fully realized secondary world. So you don't have any magic in this book, but it's a fantasy. Much like my book, The Thief, is set in a secondary world. And although there are gods and goddesses, there are no wizards, there are no spells, there's no magic wands, there's none of that kind of fantastic. But this still becomes an immersion story because you are immersed from the very first page in this secondary world that Wein created, where there is an historical Arthur. Okay, so. Each category is a mode susceptible to the quadripartite template.
Megan?
Yep.
Sorry, just a question. We had a question in the chat. If you could split apart just a little bit more the difference between liminal and immersion and give some examples of like liminal fantasy books.
Yeah, people are a little confused how you figure out which one.
Which one is a liminal? I think that for Mendlesohn, the big difference between the liminal world and the immersion world. So looking at Not Your Sidekick by C.B. Lee, I would say it is an immersion story because that world is not our world. That world is set in the future, and it's set after some sort of world-changing event which has spurred the appearance of superpowers in the population. Whereas when you go and you look at So You Want to Be a Wizard, you could say that that is an immersion story because it is not a world that is exactly like ours. If you say that the existence of some people knowing magic makes it different than ours. Mm-hmm. Not sure that that was entirely clear. Let me think of one. Armitage, Fly Away Home is one where everything is supposed to be exactly the same as our world, only with added leprechauns. So you might say that So You Want to Be a Wizard is exactly like our world, only with added wizards. And that does make it a liminal story.
Okay, just to clarify things maybe a bit more, I think this question might help. Would you say that these four definitions are more so lenses that you can view stories through rather than categories? Like there is definitely argumentation to what or multiple ones different books or whatever fall into?
So they are... I would not say that they are lenses, and I wouldn't really say that although she uses the word category, she also uses the word sets. And if you think about set theory, the circles mm-hmm. that sometimes overlap, that's an easier way to imagine how these books are organized. One book can be in multiple sets. And in the sense that it's not a lens, in the sense that it's only for looking at. I think of it more as a set of tools.
Okay.
And I think of pretty much all literary theories, like feminist theory or Freudian theory or critical race theory. They are a set of tools. and you take them with you when you approach a text. And yes, some of them are a lens in the sense that they're like a magnifying glass. That's a tool. But there's also wrenches and screwdrivers and things like that. And sometimes what you want to do with the text is take the whole thing apart and see how it works. And the different theories, feminism, Freudian, that sort of thing, are different tools that you can use. So, for example, back in the day when I was at the University of Chicago, there was a professor named Bill Veeder, and Freudian theory was really big. And people used to say that, Bill Veeder saw a penis behind every single tree. And if you took a class with Bill Veeder, then all you would be talking about the entire semester was penises, because that's what he was interested in showing people. Look in this book this way, and this is what you can see. And this book, this is what you can see. And this book, this is what you can see. And then many, many fewer people did Freudian criticism, and we don't talk about penises and trees as much. But other kinds of criticism have become important. And when you go to a text with something like feminist theory or critical race theory, the idea is that you use these tools and you either understand the text better through using these tools, or maybe you come away understanding yourself better, like in Freudian analysis, through using these tools, or maybe you come away understanding the world that you live in better because you use these tools. But in exactly the same way that you wouldn't use a hammer to put a screw in a board, you wouldn't necessarily use every tool you have all at the same time. You get specific sets of tools out when you go to run and look at a text. And what Mendelssohn is offering you here is a set of tools and a lot of observations. And we'll get along a little bit further into the observations after we get through this rather intense paragraph, where we say that each category is a mode susceptible to the quadripartite template or grammar, wrongness, thinning, recognition, and healing return that John Clute suggests in the Encyclopedia of Fantasy. Each mode places its emphasis on a different note within this 4-note bar. Within the mode, consistencies exist in the use of these templates that demonstrate coherence in the categories. Yeah, it's a heck of a paragraph, and it's actually, I think, immensely helpful. But first, look at this. This is an arc, a 5-part narrative arc that a lot of people are taught in schools. And most people have seen it at some point in their lives, where you have the exposition and an exciting incident and rising action to a climax, falling action to some sort of resolution. What Clute is talking about is just another way of looking at the narrative and dividing it instead of rising action and falling action. You start with something wrong. He describes that persistent wrongness as some kind of thinning. People recognize what the problem is, and there is a solution to the problem. And either you return to the world that you were in, or you heal the world that you were in. And what Mendelssohn is trying to say is that if you look at portal, immersion, intrusion, and liminal, they each maybe are weighted more towards one of these 4 parts of the story. So the portal story, for instance, is very much more weighted toward the idea that there is something wrong and that there will be a return. And Mendelssohn's point is that the failure to grasp the stylistic needs of a particular category of fantasy may undermine the effectiveness of an otherwise interesting idea. So and I should say here something that I should have said all the way back at the beginning. The stuff that I'm talking about here is really only the first 30 pages of Mendelssohn's book. So I'm doing a disservice to her in just chopping out a little tiny piece of it. But what she suggests is, for instance, if you take an immersive story and you use your portal voice, you tend to get a very leaden narrative. If you take a liminal story, which usually has a sort of blasé voice, as if, oh yeah, leprechauns, we know about leprechauns. And instead you have the intrusion voice of, oh my God, there's a leprechaun. It tends to be an overly contrived story. Now, just because those are the sort of stylistic templates doesn't mean that, like Diane Duane or Diana Wynne Jones, you can't deliberately mess with these things in order to get a new thing. It just means that you need to be aware, maybe, of what tone you're picking for your story and whether that tone matches the kind of story that you want to tell. The best example, and my favorite one, is if you take a horror story with vampires or werewolves or truly terrifying things, and you tell it in the kind of story, in the kind of tone of voice where all of these things are just mundane and completely ordinary, well, then you get Laurel K. Hamilton. And when the vampire comes through the doorway, instead of being terrified as you would be in a horror story, you have a description of the clothes he's wearing, at least according to Jessica, who mentioned this in the workshop the other day. I have not read Laurel K. Hamilton, so I don't know. But I don't think that she did this by accident. Her decision to take all of the features of a horror story and mix them with the tone of an immersion story has been immensely commercially successful for her. And is another example of, just because nobody's ever done it before doesn't mean that you can't. It just means that you shouldn't do it by accident. So Mendelssohn talked about the template and what things are sort of expected when you're writing a portal story. And if you're going to meet the reader's expectations, that's one thing. And if you're going to subvert the reader's expectations, that's another. But it's good to know what those expectations are before you start. So in a portal story, the reader rides along with the protagonist and learns. And if you think about it, Lucy walks through the portal, she meets Mr. Tumnus. Mr. Tumnus explains things to her. And as Lucy learns, the reader learns. And pretty much through the book, what the characters learn, the reader learns. The reader doesn't know things that the characters don't know. There's a lot of description, a lot of exposition. And that's because this world has to be explained. It's almost always linear. The person comes through, they learn about the world, they frequently go on a quest. You don't have a lot of slipping back and forth between time frames or different locations, different parts of the stories, that sort of thing. Portal stories tend to be linear, and there are a lot of quests. And that's why The Hobbit can be either an immersive story, or you can see it as a portal story, because for Bilbo, his world is very ordinary at the beginning. And then there is this amazing magical intrusion of Gandalf showing up, and he goes off on a quest to a completely fantastical world where he sees elves for the first time and dragons and things like that. And then he comes back to what's the very ordinary for him world of the Shire. So the thing about a portal story is that if it's done badly, it's really didactic. The narrator or the book tells you everything that you're supposed to think. If you want to take a portal story where you have a main character who goes into a world where he sees everything that's wrong with the world and he fixes it before he returns to his own ordinary world, then you have something that's a lot like a white savior story. And that's got some issues. But if you have exactly that same hero and he goes through that portal story, he goes through that portal, into this world where he recognizes that it's not his job to come in and tell everybody what they're doing wrong. And it's not his job to try to change things he doesn't really understand. And if he is greatly chastened by trying to do that and failing, and he learns this lesson that maybe he shouldn't butt his nose in, and then he returns to his ordinary world, well, you might have something that's not a white savior narrative, but you still have something that's a lesson. And the lesson is being delivered by the author of the book to the reader, as well as by the author of the book to the character. And if it's done badly, it can be really, really painful. And if it's done right, you know, it still tends to be authoritarian. It still tends to be the person who's writing this book is saying what's right and what's wrong and what's good and what's bad, and is just dictating in a way that doesn't necessarily leave the reader to decide for him or herself what is good or bad, or colonialist, or a white savior narrative, or that sort of thing. The author's telling you that. So in my book, Thick as Thieves, the story begins in a setting of the Mede Empire with a slave named Kemet. And Kemet is the slave of an exceptionally powerful man. And because he can wield that power himself, he's very powerful even if he is enslaved, or at least he believes he will become very powerful because he thinks that his master is going to be the right-hand man of the next emperor. And so when an Anatolian soldier shows up and says, "Hey, let me whisk you away to freedom," Kemet is not as excited by that as you might expect, because offered a choice between being very powerful but not free, or being a free, powerless, impoverished nobody in a tiny country on the other side of the Middle Sea, you know, it's just not as appealing as having personal power, at least not for Kemet. Now, when I sat down to write this book, I had to decide who was going to be the viewpoint character. This book is actually the second half, or it was originally intended to be the second half of the book, The King of Aetolia. And in The King of Aetolia, that Aetolian soldier, Costas, is the viewpoint character. And he could very well have been the viewpoint character in Thick as Thieves. But he's not. Because if he had been, this would have been almost like a portal story for him. That he goes from what's familiar to him, the country of Aetolia, to something that's completely foreign to him, the country of the Mede, and returns. It would have been a quest story. And this person, Kemet, would have been the object of his quest. And it was really important to me that Kemet was not an object. And so it was important to me that he is the viewpoint character of the story. And so it's not a portal story, and it's not a quest story. And one of the reasons for that is because I wanted to leave a lot more room for my reader to make up their own minds about the relationship between the Mede Empire and this little country of Aetolia, to the relationship between freedom and power, or fate and freedom. And I couldn't do that and put it in the form of a quest or a portal story. And I think that I thought it might be helpful to people who are writing to think about their stories in this way. Are you writing a portal story? Are you writing a quest story? Who's the authority in your story? Who gets to make up a decision about what's right and what's wrong, and who the good guys are and who the bad guys are in your story? Do you want a reader to have everything explained to them, as in a portal story? Or do you want to take your reader into an immersion story and drop them into that world and make the reader pick up all of your little tiny cues in order to understand what's going on. Mostly, I prefer to do the immersion story, but I do have one portal story, and let me check and make sure we're not like, oh, we are so totally over time.
No, you still got 5 minutes till we're at time, but there's nothing immediately after this, so
Okay.
if people want to hang around.
Okay, so I will wrap
For
up
several hours, by all means.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm gonna go for another 4 hours, I guess.
I'll wrap up very quickly with my portal story, which is in Instead of Three Wishes. And the portal story is Aunt Charlotte and the Portraits of the NGA. For you Philistines out there, that's the National Gallery of Art. For you Canadians, it's the National Gallery of Art in the United States. And in my story, I have a frame story. And in that frame story, Marguerite goes to Washington, D.C. to visit her great Aunt Charlotte. And great Aunt Charlotte tells her a story. Aunt Charlotte tells her a story of a childhood trip to Ocracoke. So you've moved from the present time into the past in Ocracoke. And in Ocracoke, Aunt Charlotte meets a Selkie, and she climbs through a magical picture frame to locate the Selkie coat and restore it to its rightful owner. Now, let me think. Yeah, see, I do a little picture of a bridge because the picture frame is a picture of Canaletto's Venice. So my main character climbs through this frame, drops into the world of Venice, wanders around until she finds the Selkie coat and comes out. So yes, I have a frame story with a frame in the middle of it. And one of these is a physical object, and one of them is a rhetorical device. And yes, this is me being clever. And no, I didn't ever expect anybody else to notice this. This is just how I entertain myself. So why the frame story in this case? It's here because I wanted to move my character from an entirely normal world to a more foreign world of Ocracoke in the past, to an entire, with fantastical elements in it, to an entirely fantastical world inside of a picture frame. And then I wanted to bring that character back. And that allows me to take the reader into that fantasy world and hopefully, like the character, come back with a little bit of fantasy that they get to hold on to. And what I thought we could do before I burn through all of my time by not watching my clock was that if those of you who are in the setting are writers or writing something, maybe you have something with a portal. Maybe you'd like to talk about the relationship between the portal and the text. Why do you have a portal? What does the portal do for your story? The inset story, when you put that frame around it. And usually when I am doing this in lieu of a workshop in the real world, what I ask people to do, if they have a piece of paper, is draw a frame, put something in the frame, and put something inside it. It's, 5 or 10 minutes isn't long enough usually to come up with a whole story, but it's long enough as a thought exercise to come up with a portal and a frame story and an inset story, and to think about what does the frame do for the story? And why would you apply that frame to that story? And if you have a story for which you have not got a frame, for the purposes of, like the next 15 minutes, take any story of yours and stick a frame on it with some sort of transitional moment between the frame and the inset story, and tell me what you think that does to your story now that it has a frame around it. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen, or at least I shall try to stop sharing the screen. Okay. And for as long as people would like to hang out, we can chat a little bit while maybe people come up with frame stories to stick around stories they already have, or come up with frame stories and inset stories from scratch. And I think it probably makes sense for anybody who would like to share to go ahead and put their hand up. And then when they're called on to turn on their camera and turn on their mic. And in the chat, anybody who has a question can ask a question and I'll try to answer it. And it can be, about Farah Mendlesohn, or it can be about anything, really. So I'm now in the chat and attempting to scroll. Yep, I'm all the way at the bottom. And yeah, I can certainly hang out for a few minutes if there's anybody. Let's just check now. Is there anybody who thinks that they'd like to share something? And is there anybody who has any questions? And if there's not, we can wrap up.
We've gotten a couple of questions in the chat just as we go.
Okay.
So that I don't remember whether we got addressed, but the most recent one is someone who's a little confused about what you mean by frame. Are you talking about the portal or the overarching plot?
When I talk about the frame, I'm talking about like with a portal story, for instance, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You have a frame story in which it's the Second World War and the Pevensey children are being evacuated from London to a big, empty, prestigious manor house in the country where presumably they will be safe. That's the frame story that's around the inset story of them going to Narnia. They go through the magic cupboard and they are in Narnia and they have a whole story and story arc of events in Narnia.
Mm-hmm.
But outside of that story, you have a frame that is a very ordinary world of World War II. So in Aunt Charlotte and the Portraits of the National Gallery of Art, you have a frame story of a girl visiting an elderly relative in Washington, D.C. And the inset story is the one that Aunt Charlotte tells. Now, it's not a portal in the sense of a physical cupboard that she goes through. It's a portal in the sense that you go from the ordinary world that she's in into the story world of Aunt Charlotte. So there's still the frame and the inset story, and the portal is metaphorical and is the storytelling device. Because the person is telling a story, the action of the story, the viewpoint moves into the story of Ocracoke that Aunt Charlotte is telling. So sometimes your portal story will have a physical portal. Sometimes your portal story is like time travel. You don't actually have a physical doorway that somebody goes through. Maybe there's some other mechanism by which they travel 100 years back in time and then are returned back to their own time at the end of the story. We would still call that a portal story because it's somebody going from one thing to another. And a frame story is just a different way of presenting that movement from an outer story to an inner story, or from a here story to a there story to a coming back story, or a here in this point of time to a time in the past and a coming back story. All of these things where you start in one place and the rest of the story takes place somewhere else, and then you come back, we call that a portal, whether there's an actual doorway that somebody goes through or not. And one reason that we call them a portal is because they share a lot of the characteristics. The quest stories, they share the characteristics of a portal story. The going back in time usually shares the characteristics of a portal story. And those characteristics are things like the main character is going to someplace new that's bizarre, that they've never been before, and they are getting explanations and learning about that world at the same time that the reader is learning about the world. There's a lot of exposition and a lot of description. There's almost always some sort of a goal that has to be met before, in the end, you come back to where you started. Those are the characteristics of a portal story. Now, I'm suddenly reminded of a book by Nancy Bond, and I'm not going to be able to get the title correct, but I think it might be something like A Key in Time. But a young woman is doing reenactment at some place that looks a lot like Old Williamsburg, and she is transported back in time. And it feels very much like a portal story. She is completely taken by surprise. She doesn't know this world. This isn't exactly the world that she has learned about in her history books. So there's a lot of exposition and a lot of description, and the reader is learning things in exactly the same way that the character is learning things. And you get closer and closer to the end of the book, and you wonder how it is that she's eventually going to be returned to her own time. And then she doesn't get returned to her own time. She just has to get used to it. She's 200 years in the past. And what the author Nancy Bond has done is sucker you in with all of the appropriate trappings of a portal story so that you think you know where this book is going, and then she doesn't take you there. So what we're talking about when we're talking about the characteristics of a portal story is a typical story. And when you know the typical way things go, then you can play with your reader's expectations if you want. You can be like Diana Wynne Jones, and you can have a portal story only shown from the other side of the portal. So Howl's Moving Castle is an immersion story instead. Or you can be like Diane Duane, and you can create an intrusion story where this magical book shows up on a shelf. And instead of having everything magical go away, like at the end of Black and Blue Magic, when you've used up the magic potion and now everything magical is gone from your world and everything's ordinary again. No, she subverts that expectation, and she says, no, these people, they're just going to go on in this newly magicalified world. And so she plays with the idea of the intrusion story, and she delivers an immersive world for you that you then get to play in for book after book after book, which is one of the things I love about a good immersion story. And I hope that was an answer to the question. Is there any other questions?
Oh, we've got many in the chat.
Okay. Yes, somebody mentioned
the chat, or do you want me to just keep reading them off for you?
You know, I'm a string in the harp. Thank you. Somebody gave me the title of the Nancy Bond book. I think that is it. And somebody mentioned Margaret Peterson Haddock's Running Out of Time, which again is a subversion of an immersion story. You think that you're in one kind of story and you're in a different kind of story. But no, if you could read the question so that everybody doesn't have to watch me mindlessly scrolling back, that might be good.
Alrighty. So have Grixit, you just said question. Did you want to turn on your mic and say your question, or?
I see Grixit has a question in the chat. How do internal quests fit in? Grixit,
yeah, I was referring to ones where the travel is the person's own psychology. Maybe they actually made a connection, maybe they didn't. But usually it has to do with what's going on with them on the outside. I'm thinking one example that's really kind of out of genre is I Never Promised You a Rose Garden.
Huh.
Young woman in a mental institution, and sometimes sometimes she takes refuge in fantasy, which helps her cope sometimes with her own situation. Another one is The Interior Life. A woman with a really what she considers a really boring life copes by daydreaming, and she thinks about her daydreams and decides, I'll revisit that one. And she has one which is a fantasy, and for a long time it seems to consume her. But hey, she gets her chores done.
Right, and I wanted to say that Mendelssohn does in fact address the idea of the interior quest, and if you're looking at I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, which I remember on the shelf of my library in like 7th grade, but which I've never read. Well, what if you're looking at it and say you have a friend who says, I really like a good quest story, and you think about I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, and you ask yourself, would this satisfy my friend who's looking for a quest? The answer could be yes or no, depending on your friend.
Well, at the end of...
Yeah, so maybe your friend is open to the idea of having her idea of quest somewhat expanded, or not. So when you're trying to decide quest, non-quest for your friend, look at the story, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, and see stylistically how many of the boxes does it check off. And if it checks off the sort of typical quest of discovery and exposition, and the reader learns as the character learns, then I would argue you've got a quest story, whether it's interior or not. But if the person who's the main character is actually already entirely familiar with this interior landscape, like for instance, what's the Perg book? The Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Do I have that right?
Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Exactly. That's a case where you might argue that it was a quest because there's a lot of traveling and there's a goal and everything. But that main character is so familiar with that interior landscape, and he's explaining everything to the reader. And I would argue that in that case, you don't have a quest book. And that what's different, what makes something a quest or not a quest is whether or not you do the right questy things, whether you're doing them inside your own head or outside, whether you're doing them by traveling back in time or traveling through a wardrobe or traveling magically through space or whatever. If you're doing the questy things, you have a goal and you come back. So so you want to be a wizard. There's that section where they go through a portal and they have a quest. They need to get that space pen back. And then they return to their world through that portal. So she sort of inset a portal story into an immersion story. So when you look at the books you picked, in order to answer the question, I'd have to have read them, and I'd have to be able to say, well, they satisfy this, 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 and this. And yeah, I would say that's pretty questy.
Okay. But there's another version, which I've never read in a book, but it's in television a lot. And that is the protagonist is dying, and there's something about his situation where it somehow relates to some problem they have, and they're having, and while they're on the outside, their body is failing. Inside, they're pursuing something which is often symbolic. For example, it was an episode of MacGyver in which MacGyver, I think, got shot. I'm not sure, but he's hallucinating that he's trapped on a ship, which is called the Osiris. And the idea is he has to figure out how to get off the ship before it leaves, thus, taking him off into the land of the dead. There's a similar one on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, in which Julian Bashar is dying, and he's running around in something that looks like the Deep Space Nine the space station, but he's dealing with things that are the part of his life that are helping or hindering him. Of course, the biggest problem is Garrick, the Cardassian spy, and also his buddy that comments on his situation and says, I don't trust you. Maybe you're getting smarter. And somehow the idea is that if the person fails on their internal quest, then the nebulous concept will to live will fail, and then their body will just give up.
So do you remember an hour ago, I was talking about these categories and comparing them to the argument about what are the 10 best rock albums of all time. With these categories, you have a great opportunity to have a million fun conversations with all of your friends about which category a particular book goes into. And if you're going to take something like the MacGyver episode, or you're going to take Howl's Moving Castle or Harry Potter. Harry Potter is a good example, especially in that first book. Is it immersion? Is it intrusion? You can have a beer in the bar. And if we were doing this in the real world, I would hope that we would all go downstairs to the steakhouse that Diane mentioned in the opening ceremony. I think it was in the opening ceremony. And we'd all have a drink and we'd all talk about our favorite books and what category they go into. And that would be fun. Unless you're with somebody who's not fun and just wants to tell you, what category I think they're in. And sometimes I'm definitely that person. But what Mendelssohn is thinking of is not so much that you could ever clearly peg these things into exactly this category or that category. What Mendelssohn is suggesting is that you can use this as a critic, because she's a literary critic, to break down the story into pieces and get an idea of how it works. I use it as a writer because that's really important to me. I look at what somebody else has done and I break it down into its pieces. And I say, this person could be writing horror, but she's not, because she spends a lot of time discussing people's clothing and nobody's surprised when a vampire comes in. So this person has deliberately created this mix, not horror, and not strictly speaking, somewhere a mix of horror with the tone of ennui that comes with an immersion story. Maybe I want to try doing that. And so as a reader, it's a useful thing to me because it helps me find the stories that I want to read. It helps me talk to other people about what stories I like so they can recommend things. If anybody has a recommendation, lay it on me, for really good portal stories where it's not super didactic. Maybe if you have a recommendation for a subversion of the Portal story, like Howl's Moving Castle, I'd love you to put it in the chat. So what I'm saying is that you can have a fun conversation about what goes into what category, but you as a writer can look at somebody's story and see how they chose to use the rhetorical devices in the story that they're telling that either worked or didn't work. Because sometimes you look at that overly contrived story, or you look at your own overly contrived story, and you realize that you're using the wrong voice for your Portal story, or you're not telling a Portal story, so you shouldn't be using that tone of wonder and awe every time you see a new thing. No. You're telling an immersion story, and so you should tone down the wonder and awe and amazement, and instead work a little bit more on how do you seamlessly introduce all of the facts of your immersive world without making it an info dump. So,
Okay.
so it can be a tool, it can be a fun conversation, or it can just be a learning experience when you watch how other people did it and you take it and you apply it to your own work.
Okay. As somebody had asked before, are you going to provide us with a list of these books you've been talking about?
Yes, we're gonna.
Okay. All right. Then,
Staff would like your presentation, please.
Okay.
Because we're
Okay,
keeping a
thank
list
you.
of books recommended by panelists.
I'll
Okay.
step down now.
So did anybody have a Portal story they wanted to describe?
Um,
I'm not seeing anybody, which is fine because this wasn't set up as a workshop. It was a non-workshop, so that's okay. And I think that thank you all for coming.
Could you hear me?
oh,
Agnes, I
Yeah,
can hear you
hi.
now.
Yeah. I was thinking about Pullman, who wrote The Golden Compass, and especially in the second book, the something knife, the subtle knife.
The subtle
I
knife,
think
right?
there is a portal, but I think there's some kind of didactic stuff going on in these books.
That is
Yeah.
an intense, there's an understatement. Yeah, I find him anyway to be intensely didactic. And I admit I found that rather off-putting
Me too.
in the first book, especially. Oddly, he was sort of at max. I guess didacticism is the word. By the time he got to the third book, he was, all out. Let me make an argument here. But I really felt like his arguing skills had gotten better by the third book, and it was less didactic, oddly. I found the first book to be the most heavy-handed in his characterizations of right and wrong and good and bad and that sort of thing. I think there was accidentally a little more wiggle room by the time he got to the third book.
I
but
think
yes.
I personally was too young at that time to notice the didactic stuff going on in the first book, and I only noticed it later on in the trilogy.
Yeah.
And then I finished it, but
yeah, some really amazing world building in Pullman's books, and
Sure.
And a really interesting use of portals, because he is subverting the idea of you go into another world, you become a better person, and you come back, which is sort of the traditional portal setup or quest setup. You're supposed to go off on your quest, become enlightened. Sometimes, it's not even the object of your quest, but rather the friends you make along the way that is the success of your story. And then you come back a better person. And for Pullman, it's like, no, you just go in a different world and you're the same person in a different world that you were at home, which, minus the didacticism, is a really interesting idea. And mostly, I really did like the books 1 and 3 the best? Masha? Shall we?
Oh no, I was just agreeing with you.
that was a murmur. I think we should probably wrap up though, because it is 1:25. We're half an hour over, and people presumably have lives to get back to. And shall I just send you a list of the books?
Or your slides, whichever is easier for you. That would be great.
Okay, well, we'll figure that out in email. And in the meantime, thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you all for coming. And if you enjoyed this panel, registration for 2022 is open next year. If you go out to the info desk, there is a treasure chest where you can buy your badge for next year. Or if you want to support us with a one-time donation, you can do that at our Ko-fi, kofi.com/mpotfozing, or the pile of coins on the front of the info desk. And if you want to buy a book plate signed by Megan Whalen Turner, our merch store is also at the info desk. It is a pile of little books. And there will be a staff member over there if you need help. Thank you all so much for coming, and we will see you back here later.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.